Howls of the West. The west wind, heavy with salt and omen, whistled through the cliffs when Aodhgall felt the shift. The air tightened like a rope about to snap. He raised a hand, and his men, needing no more, formed a silent circle. Then the forest exploded. The attack had begun. A piercing scream, Urani, rose above the roar, striking Aodhgall's heart like an arrow. A blink later he understood. Dòrnait had been taken. It wasn't a mere ambush, it was a hunt. And she was the prey. In the shadows he recognized faces. Men of Terbert, his enemy by blood and lineage. It wasn't a coincidence. They sought to reclaim his sister, or to prevent her from choosing freely. But he would not let her go without a fight. The battle erupted with primal fury. The clash of steel against steel echoed with the same wild rhythm as the sea waves smashing the rocks. Aodhgall fought like a man possessed, his claymore tracing arcs of death, his dagger striking with ruthless precision. His thoughts were twofold: protect his sisters and reach Dòrnait. He ordered Coanich to escort Roisiel and Urani to the castle, whose towers rose in the distance like a sanctuary of stone and mist. The rest he gathered at his side, and with fierce determination carved his way through the trees. But a doubt gnawed at him. If he reached her, would she want to stay? Dòrnait, caught between two men, shivered when she saw him emerge from the forest like a war spirit. His figure led the way, followed by a handful of loyal men. Their eyes met, and in his she saw a fear born of love. Not fear of battle, but fear of losing her. She recalled her mother's words, "Highlanders are barbarians, soulless killers." Yet in Aodhgall she had found another truth. The hand that kills is also the one that knows how to hold with tenderness. The eyes that challenge death also seek comfort. Malkuth, one of her brother's men, raised his sword. Dòrnait, hesitant, couldn't move. Torrin pulled at her insistently. "This is no place for you, milady." But she did not move. She did not want to leave. She couldn't. Aodhgall was already locked in close combat with Malkuth, the forest vibrating with their movements. Every blow, every charge, echoed like a Celtic war drum. The fury of battle soaked into the damp ground, where the ancient sleeping gods, Cernunnos, Lu, Tyrannus, seemed to watch from the shadows of the oaks. Blood splattered the leaves like ink from a cursed grimoire. Dòrnait barely breathed. One of Aodhgall's men fell, his scream dissolving into the murmur of the sea. The circle tightened around him. And still Aodhgall resisted. Wounded, gasping, but untamable. Until a sword struck his head and he fell like a stone. "No!" Dòrnait shouted, her voice heavy with desperation. She threw herself over his body, covering him with hers. His chest still rose faintly. He was alive. Torrin arrived with his sword drawn. "Step aside, milady. I'm not leaving him." Echan appeared at her side, his face bloodied but standing firm. "The lady has spoken," he said firmly. Terbert's men hesitated. A shadow crossed their faces, not of doubt but of respect. It was not a maiden they faced, but a woman who had chosen. "Your brother only wants to keep you safe," one insisted. "Tell him I'm already safe," she replied. "And happy where I am." The sky darkened as the cawing of crows rose above the grove. The battlefield smelled of iron and churned earth. The castle in the distance looked like a sanctuary carved out of the mist. They still didn't know if the battle was over, or if it was just the beginning of a deeper one. But one truth shone clear as the evening star over the sea waters: Dòrnait did not want to flee. She was staying. For love. Chapter 28. Aodhgall opened his eyes with the weight of the world pressing on his forehead. A dull drum throbbed in his skull, as if 1,000 stones had fallen from the heights to crash against his head. But through the haze of pain he felt something else, a warm, delicate body pressed against his own, like the breath of an angel amid the battlefield. Dòrnait's words came to him clear as a bell in an abandoned monastery. She declared before the men of her brother's clan that she wished to stay with him. His heart jumped so violently that for a moment he thought it would break too. "Are you sure, girl?" She looked at him. Those blue eyes, as vast as the calm sea after the storm, pierced him with a certainty no words could deny. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," she said. Her voice had the clarity of a psalm sung at dawn, and something in it awakened echoes of ancient songs speaking of promises made under the moon and sealed with the blood of gods. Aodhgall then looked at Eachan, who had already stepped forward, understanding his intent, and positioned himself between him and Terbert's men. With a dull effort, stifling the pain clutching his temple and arm, Aodhgall stood up. He helped Dòrnait to her feet and walked toward Torrin, the war chief, a man hardened by as many battles as the winters that streaked his temples. "You've heard the lady, Torrin. She doesn't want to leave." "I have orders," the other said, but his eyes flicked toward the forest where the mist was beginning to dissolve the shadows among the oaks. Perhaps he hoped for reinforcements. "Don't let your men return," warned Aodhgall, placing Dòrnait behind him. He raised his sword, still stained with blood. "This land has claimed too many lives today. Leave now, or you'll be the next to join the ancestors." Torrin watched him, puzzled. "You speak boldly for a wounded man with only one companion at your side, facing three." Eachan growled indignantly, but Aodhgall held him back with a single look. "Maybe," he said calmly. "But I have a reason to fight." His eyes rested on Dòrnait. The silence that followed was more eloquent than 1,000 proclamations. "Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air like a distant bell in the fog. "Tell your lord that his kind invitation has been refused. The lady has chosen her place," Aodhgall concluded. Torrin stared at him for a long moment, doubt etched in the furrows of his brow. Finally, he addressed Dòrnait with parting words. "If you change your mind." "She won't," Aodhgall replied like a wall. Torrin hesitated, but finally turned on his heel. He gave a signal, and the men retreated toward the forest clearing. The branches swallowed them, and with them for the moment vanished the threat of the Duart clan. But Aodhgall knew this was far from over. When the last shadow disappeared, he held Dòrnait close to his chest. She, as if an invisible dam inside her had broken, began to weep fiercely. Her body trembled in his arms like a fawn barely escaped from a wolf's jaws. Aodhgall embraced her without a word. He felt the pain burning in his arm, the blood still warm running down his side, but also a new serenity, as if the Holy Spirit had descended in the form of peace. In that moment, he understood that his soul, forever wandering, had finally found a home. Eachan, respectful, stepped away to tend to the bodies. Soon Coanich and his men would arrive, not to fight, but to carry the fallen to rest beneath the clan's sacred stones. In silence, Aodhgall whispered the name of each who had died. A warrior's duty did not end with the sword. He must also honor the memory of his brothers. Dòrnait was still sobbing, and her dress was beginning to soak with his blood. But she didn't care. And Aodhgall cared even less. In the midst of the death-stained field, he had found life. "What is this, girl?" he whispered, stroking her face. There was a small scratch on her cheek, red as an offering. "I thought you were dead," she murmured, unable to hold back her sobs. "When I saw the sword strike your head." "And that made you cry like this?" She tapped him gently on the chest. "Of course, you fool. What did you think? Maybe that you didn't want to marry me." She hesitated, her lips trembling. "Oh, that. I didn't realize then that." He waited. The sky above them began to stain amber and violet. The light danced in Dòrnait's golden curls. "You didn't realize what?" "That I love you," she said at last with trembling sweetness. Her eyes shone, not only from tears but from the truth that had just been born. An ancient feeling, vast as the ocean, washed over him. How could a woman like this, free, brave daughter of powerful lineages, offer him her heart? He found no words. He could only lift her face tenderly and answer. "And I love you, stubborn one." She looked at him, half incredulous, half moved. "Really? Why didn't you tell me before?" Aodhgall smiled wryly. "I had never felt anything like this. I thought this madness driving me toward you could only be that, madness." "Uncontainable irrationality," murmured Dòrnait, finally smiling. "A fitting name for love." "And yet it is love," he said, with the certainty of one returned from the other world to declare it. He pulled her close, ignoring the sharp pain in his arm. She, with her cheek against his chest, sighed. "Try to get rid of me now. I'm more stubborn than you imagine." He suddenly grew serious. "Does that mean you'll agree to marry me?" Dòrnait lifted her face, and her smile was like the first sun over the ancient stones of Dunbray Castle. "Yes, I will marry you, Aodhgall MacCraith." Then he kissed her. Not with the passion of a soldier, but with the devotion of a pilgrim who has finally found his sanctuary. It was a kiss that spoke the language of sacred things, sealing a promise woven with swords, blood, tears, and love. Chapter 29. The Storm and the Dawn. "He loves me." Every time Dòrnait recalled those words, it felt as if her heart would burst like a wave crashing against the cliffs. Since the attack at the Pool of Sighs, that certainty wrapped around her like the sweetness of an ancient spell, as if the very spirits of the water had whispered that promise to the wind. And in the tense hours that followed, saved by life and still stained with fresh blood, she kept repeating it silently to herself. After securing Uranie and Roisiel, Cohen each returned with trusted men, interrupting the kiss that had silently sealed the threshold of something sacred. While he oversaw the removal of enemy bodies, Dòrnait tended to the wound Aodhgall had received in his shoulder. The cut was deep, almost ritualistic. With trembling but steady hands she cleaned and bandaged it, tearing strips from the warrior's own torn shirt. He, stoic, claimed he felt no pain, but in his eyes shone something deeper, the intimate delight of being cared for by her. Grateful for the excuse to touch him without restraint, Dòrnait fully gave herself to this simple and sacred act. And when he offered to ride back to the castle together, she didn't hesitate. The gallop was a balm. The sun, fading into a sea still roaring from battle, bathed them in golden light, and the warmth of Aodhgall's body against her back seemed to shield her from all harm. The horror of the attack receded before this new, powerful comfort, the comfort of reciprocated love. It seemed sinful to be so happy. Even later, as she prepared to sleep in her tower chamber, the fortune life had granted her, so stingy with her mother, still felt unreal. Ironies of fate. Had she not been kidnapped, she might now be under the yoke of a loveless marriage with Lord Finlage. She shivered. She would never have known this, the sacred trembling of true love, the miracle of feeling desired by someone who saw beyond title and dowry. For years she had built walls, fearing her mother's fate. But Aodhgall, as stubborn as the north wind, had torn down those defenses without asking. Dòrnait never did anything halfway. And now she had surrendered. Before the mirror, she adjusted the tie of her silk nightgown, blew out the candle, and for a moment only the night breathed beyond the window. Meanwhile, Aodhgall wandered his chamber with the restlessness of a warrior who cannot find peace. The fire blazed below, casting tall shadows on the stone walls. He took a swig of Uisci Bitha, vainly trying to ease the burning in his wounded shoulder, and another fire burning deeper inside. Since he had left her in her room, his body found no rest. He had held her warm and trembling in his arms, and as soon as he let her go, the emptiness returned. Like the earth after the storm. He paced like a caged lion. This was not the brutal desire that came after battle. This was different. It was her. He wanted to possess her, yes, but he also wanted to seal their love, protect her, honor her. Only he could not yet. Not without telling her everything. The deal with Aodhgall hung over their heads like a black cloud. If she knew, would she still look at him with that luminous faith? He knew what he could lose, everything. That was why he was already planning the rescue of his brother Fionn from Blackness prison. The news was hopeful. The sea tower had windows. And a shepherd, a pious soul, occasionally visited the prisoners. It would be enough to impersonate him, hide a rope in his habit, and descend at night. The sea, an old ally of the clans, would do the rest. His men had forbidden him to go himself. As chief, his place was here. So Coinage would go in his name. Everything was ready. The rope. The Berlin. Hope. And just when he thought he had sealed his resolve, the door creaked softly. "Bring me another bottle of claret. That will be all. We're not even married yet, and you're already ordering me around," said a familiar voice, sweet as wild honey. The air grew heavy. Aodhgall turned, and for a moment the sight took his breath away. There was Dòrnait, barefoot, her hair loose like a pagan blessing, and dressed only in an ivory silk nightgown that barely concealed anything. In the firelight she looked like a Celtic apparition, tempting, sacred, irrevocable. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out hoarse. "I can't sleep," she said. "And it seems you can't either." She moved with the rhythm of a priestess dancing beneath the moon. Her scent wrapped around him like a spell. She touched him. And his blood roared in response. "I thought it was obvious." It was. She was offering herself. And he burned to take her. But something held him back. Honor. The pact. The unspoken promise. "I thought maybe you'd prefer to wait until we were husband and wife," he stammered. She frowned, confused. "What about the banns?" "I wrote to your cousin. They'll grant us a dispensation." Dòrnait smiled, amused. "How diligent." "I didn't want you to change your mind." "I won't." She curled against his chest, her body barely covered. Her breasts rose like a pagan prayer beneath the silk. Desire struck him like a wave. She asked if anyone already knew she wasn't a virgin. "I won't tell unless it's necessary," he said, his voice low. Then her hands touched him as if reciting an ancient psalm. He closed his eyes. He couldn't think. Only feel. "We'll marry on Sunday," he said at last. 4 days. An eternity. "Too long," she whispered, tracing her fingers over his belly, each touch a temptation. "Do you love me?" Dòrnait asked, her voice a vulnerable whisper. He looked at her, and his whole soul poured into the answer. "With all my heart." "Then prove it." And he did. As if the universe demanded it. As if by joining with her, he sealed an ancient pact of blood and destiny. His kiss was a torrent, and she answered with the wild strength of an island maiden, of an ancient goddess newly awakened. Aodhgall didn't know if the world would end that night, but if it did, he would leave having truly loved. The threshold of fire. The salty sea breeze whistled through the castle stones like an ancient echo, carrying with it the breath of old legends. The flickering candlelight danced on the walls, casting shadows that seemed like Celtic spirits summoned in an ancient rite of union. Dòrnait, standing by the bed, felt her blood ignite as she watched Aodhgall approach her, wrapped in the golden glow of the fire. The bandage on his arm, fragile and fresh, did nothing to diminish the strength radiating from his body. If anything, it made him more human, more his own. Desire mingled with tenderness. But what unsettled her most was his gaze. There was no vulgar lust or conquest in it. There was worship. It was as if his eyes undressed her without shame, but with devotion. As if he saw her body as a temple, not just any flesh. Dòrnait trembled. "Does your arm still hurt?" she asked softly, not letting go of his wrist. "No." His voice was deep, almost a whisper of thunder. "Selenade healed it after dinner." She lowered her gaze for a moment. The healer's name slipped like a thorn through her thoughts. She bit her lip, aware of the foolishness of her jealousy but unable to deny her wound. "What hurts you now, Monayan Don?" "Nothing." She held his gaze, but her eyes spoke more than she wished. Aodhgall raised his hand and brushed her brow with his thumb. Jealous? Of Ceannfhionn? She hesitated. What if you saw me alone with a man who has shared my bed? Would you still laugh the same? He turned to stone. No. I would kill him. And since you will never share your bed with anyone but me, it won't be necessary. And you? Does the same apply? I won't be a wife who looks the other way. His smile was slow, trembling with emotion, without arrogance. I made you a promise, Dòrnait. I will never dishonor you. Then yes, his heart opened. His soul felt light as a bundle of feathers in the wind. Without thinking, she threw herself into his arms. Her nakedness melted into his, like water meeting after a long winter. The contact of her breasts against his chest was a slow fire. Dòrnait let the world fade away, and there was only him. Aodhgall kissed her deeply, as if his tongue carried the salt of the tides. She answered with hunger and longing, with the sweet desperation of one who finally belongs. Her fingers buried themselves in his back, guiding him, provoking him, awakening in her an ancient fire, as if the old gods of the forests and stones inhabited her. You are my only prayer, he murmured against her ear, his breath flowing over her like a warm blessing. He kissed her slowly, descending over her neck and collarbones, like a monk tracing a sacred reliquary. His lips reached her breasts, and there he paused. The contrast of the warmth of his mouth with the cold air made her moan. Dòrnait arched, desperate for more. And when he finally took her nipple in his mouth, she felt pleasure rise from the center of her chest and flow like sap through her body. She grabbed his hair, silently begging him not to stop. When he descended over her belly, she knew where he was going. She knew what was coming. But she didn't want to stop him. She couldn't. Her body offered itself without reservations, like fertile earth to the rain. He kissed her in the most intimate place and took her to the edge with every stroke of his tongue, as if it were the only way to name her. Dòrnait felt herself break, something in her center exploding in a flash of light. She screamed his name as if invoking him in a prayer. Afterwards, trembling, she saw him rise. The breeze moved the linen curtains like liturgical veils, and the candlelight made his silhouette look like a freshly carved Celtic god. She stopped him with her hand on his waist. Let me, she whispered, and she saw the spark of wonder and desire entwined in his eyes. She knelt before him, and with trembling hands unbuttoned his trousers. The touch of his skin was a revelation. Aodhgall's body was a hymn of battle, marked by scars and muscles, but also tenderness and loyalty. When she touched his erection, Dòrnait felt powerful, loved, free. With every caress, he held back a moan, like a wild animal chained by will. But when she looked into his eyes, her mouth barely grazing his hardness, he understood her intent. May I? She asked, timid but firm. Aodhgall looked at her, as if the sky had opened before him. God, yes. And then Dòrnait lowered her head. Not as submission, but as an offering. The sea wind licked the castle battlements, like an ancient creature remembering the secrets now resting inside. Beyond the half-closed windows the candles danced with the breeze, casting trembling shadows on the stone walls, as if angels and ancient spirits silently watched the mystery of that union. Aodhgall's body still clung to Dòrnait's, both still trembling with the intensity of the joy that had swept over them like a gentle but relentless storm. The golden light bathed their skin like a sacred oil, and the murmur of the sea seemed to accompany their shared breathing. This was not simply rest after desire, but a kind of intimate liturgy, a promise sealed in flesh and soul. She lay on his chest, her hair spread like golden linen, fingers entwined with his. Her scent, mixed with sea salt and the warmth of passion, seemed the purest perfume she had ever breathed. There was something of Brigid in Dòrnait, the ancient Celtic goddess of spring and tenderness, and at the same time something of the Virgin who consoles the suffering. He felt her then not just as a woman, but as a sacred being. I never thought I could feel this, she whispered, barely audible, as if afraid to break the spell. Neither did I, he said, brushing her forehead with his lips, as if kissing her to protect her from all the evils in the world. For a moment, no words were needed. The silence was complete but not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms under the starry sky, when the old gods keep their counsel and the heart expands like the sea under the moon. She lifted herself slightly, cheeks flushed and eyes moist, her gaze sinking into his. I have spent my whole life longing to be loved by someone who could see beyond my whims and gestures, by someone who could touch my soul without fear. She swallowed. And you have seen me. Aodhgall held her with a restrained tremor. His soul ached knowing how little she had been valued by those who failed to guess her light. He kissed her again, this time with the delicacy reserved for a relic, with the respect and passion that only true love can birth. You are more than I dared to imagine, Dòrnait. As if the old myths I heard as a boy had taken shape in you. They looked at each other, as if the world had stopped for a moment between two heartbeats. And when she rested again on him, eyelids closed and breathing calm, he raised his eyes to the vaulted ceiling, whispering a wordless prayer. Perhaps to God, perhaps to the ancient deities still living among the island's crags, asking to be allowed to keep that peace. The sea struck the rocks again with a soft roar, like a heartbeat in the distance. Night had fully fallen over Dunsagothan Castle. Outside, the crescent moon rose above the ocean like a white, benevolent eye, watching over mortals who in their flesh and spirit sought redemption through love. And as Aodhgall held Dòrnait close to his chest, he knew, with the certainty of men marked by fate, that the love born between them would be both their shield and their curse, their strength and their sacrifice. Because the world beyond that sacred chamber would not so easily forgive their happiness. But for now she was in his arms and he was inside her, not just in body but in all a man could offer, and that was enough. She doesn't run from him. She runs from the reflection he awakens, a life where being loved is not a duty but a choice. And that, for someone forged in sacrifices, is scarier than the cold of the fjord. He thinks protecting her means keeping her close, mastering the wind. But love isn't built with bars, nor with promises sealed by blood. True love surrenders. And that, for a man raised in steel, is a surrender that hurts more than war. Both have inherited a resistance to tenderness, as if loving meant exposing themselves to death. And maybe it does. Because love, the real deep kind, demands that the mask dies, that the soul bows, that the ego dissolves. Chapter 30. The last sigh of the old clans. 3 days later, as the first light of dawn bathed the moor in a golden glow, Aodhgall was once again among his men, setting the pace of their training with steady movements. The sounds of clashing swords and shouted commands mingled with the cold wind blowing in from the sea, carrying with it the salt and mist that shrouded the coast. Dunsagothan Castle, sturdy and eternal, rose in the distance, its towers and walls like ancient guardians of a realm marked by legends. It was at that very moment that Coanich, covered in dust and sweat, approached him. His face was grimy, his breathing ragged, still bearing the marks of hard roads and rough terrain. The look in his eyes left no doubt, the news he carried was dark. "I'm sorry, my lord," Coanich said, his voice deep and broken by fatigue. "The rescue didn't work." Aodhgall, who until then had maintained a tense calm, felt as if a rock had fallen on his chest. The cold sea air, which had felt fresh at first, now seemed like an icy shroud. There was nowhere to hide from that feeling of helplessness. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight, barely audible over the roar of the wind. Coanich paused, choosing his words carefully, knowing everything he said would weigh like a curse. "Everything seemed to be going well," he began. Hugh managed to sneak past the guards and pass the rope to Fionn. "We were ready for the Berlin, waiting in the shadow of the tower, when it happened. They discovered him." Aodhgall felt fury building inside him, like the sea before a storm. But he held back. This was not the time to lose control. Not yet. "And Fionn?" The word left his lips like a dagger, cold and sharp. Someone pulled the rope back up. "At first we feared the worst. We thought they might cut it, and the fall would kill him." Aodhgall stepped back, his hands gripping the hilt of his claymore so tightly his knuckles turned white. The thought of losing his brother. Fionn, who had always been his shadow, his friend, his companion in the darkest moments. The weight of guilt crushed him. And what happened next? The question came out with difficulty, caught in the rage that gripped him. The soldier in the tower left his post to relieve himself. He looked up and saw movement. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind and the sound of a sword dropping to the ground. Disbelief filled Aodhgall's chest. A man had lost his brother's freedom over something as trivial as a human need. All because of a single moment of carelessness. Sensing his lord's growing anger, Ceannfhionn continued in a graver tone. The man inside the castle followed orders and met us in Caneil by the harbor. But Fionn has been thrown into the well. A cold sweat ran down Aodhgall's back at those words. The Blackness Well. A cursed place reserved for the most despicable, where the tides brought the icy sea water, condemning prisoners to cold and darkness. Fionn wouldn't survive there more than a week. The possibility of losing him struck Aodhgall like a lightning bolt. He let the frustration wash over him, but only for a moment. The fear of losing Dòrnait had driven him to cling to a desperate plan, and now that same desperation was making things worse. He couldn't allow his emotions to take control. The only option left was to turn to Aodhgall. A deep sigh escaped his chest, merging with the wind. The solution was clear, though painful. Dòrnait would have to understand that the decisions ahead were no longer his alone to make. The politics of alliances, the fate of his brother, the weight of his bloodline, all of it was pushing them toward a destiny that could no longer be avoided. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, casting a soft but steady light across the mountains and the sea. Deep inside, Aodhgall knew he had found love, yes, but he also knew that war and the promises made in ancient pacts could not be ignored. He and Dòrnait had been fortunate to find something real amid the fog of family expectations, but that didn't mean fate could be rewritten. The symbol of the cross, carved into the stone of his sword, reminded him of what was at stake. He was not only a man of war, but also a man of honor, forged in the tradition of his clan, shaped by the Celtic and Christian beliefs that defined his being. He was a fusion of both worlds, and every action he took forced him to choose between them. "Have Aodhgall ready," he said, his voice firm as steel. "We leave for the south at dawn. We can't afford to lose more time." Chapter 31. The atmosphere in Aodhgall's chamber was thick, heavy with restrained tension. As the wedding day drew closer, his moments with Dòrnait grew more intense, as if an invisible fire was consuming them. The hours passed, and the nights became filled with a passion that could not be quenched. In whispers and caresses, Dòrnait's body responded to his presence, anticipating the nearness of the inevitable. Yet no matter how consuming their passion, it could not quiet Aodhgall's worries. Even in their moments of ecstasy, when his possession of Dòrnait was deep, overwhelming, his mind kept drifting to what lay ahead, the wedding, the destiny that bound them not only through love but through duty. Politics, the honor of his clan, the sacrifice he had chosen to make for the good of all, these weighed heavier on him than ever. Dòrnait, aware of his need, could not help but respond to his touch, but she could also sense the storm building inside him. Though their embraces burned hot, something in the air remained unyielding. At last he pulled away and looked at her with a mix of tenderness and sorrow in his eyes. On impulse, he whispered to her about a surprise he had prepared. Their walk through the castle was not just a simple passage from one room to another. It was a reminder of all that was about to change. When Dòrnait saw the trunks with her dresses, surprise lit her face. Though grateful, a faint unease crept through her body as she realized the extent of what he had done for her. Emotions clashed in her mind, gratitude for his generosity, but also a growing concern for the future, for what marriage truly meant, for the personal cost it would bring. Aodhgall, though pleased by her reaction, could not escape the unrest that consumed him. The image of his brother Fionn trapped in that pit, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, clouded his thoughts. He needed Dòrnait's embrace, but he also needed to fulfill a destiny he could not avoid. The gift of the shoes, a token that spoke of love, was a symbol of a bond that, though genuine, was marked by the political weight he could not elude. As Dòrnait slipped her feet into the shoes he had commissioned for her, she was caught in the beauty of the gesture. Yet something deep inside told her this was only a reflection of what was to come. A marriage sealed not only by love, but also by secrets and promises Aodhgall had yet to reveal. The luxury of the dresses, the pearl-adorned shoes, and Dòrnait's smile at his gift stood in stark contrast to the shadow hanging over Aodhgall. The passion they shared could not mask the pressure of what was about to unfold. And yet, in the brilliance of Dòrnait's eyes, the uncertainty of the future seemed to fade, if only for a moment. But how long would that escape last? Chapter 32. Fates that crossed in the storm. Dunbray Castle looked like a sleeping giant upon the cliff, embraced by the wind and the sound of the sea crashing against the dark rocks below. The salty breeze kissed the battlements, carrying with it the freshness of dawn, while the warm glow of the chandeliers inside danced in rhythm with the shadows like an ancient whisper. Dòrnait felt a little lighter with every step she took down the cold corridors, the echo of her shoes ringing against stones worn by centuries. She knew that everything that had happened so far was only a prelude to what was yet to come. The emotion in her chest refused to fade. Her heart pounded harder every time she thought of Aodhgall, a man who had gone from being her captor to becoming something unexpected, a refuge where, if only for moments, she felt safe. The softness in his touch, the gentleness he had shown, it wasn't what she had expected. But what surprised her most was what he awakened in her. When she stepped into the private chamber, the air felt charged with a tension that was almost tangible. Aodhgall stood with his back to her, staring into the flames of the fireplace as they twisted like serpents under the relentless gaze of the wind slipping in from outside. The other two men, his cousin Aodhgall and his brother Fjord, rose immediately. Each of them carried a different air, as if burdened with old secrets and ancient bonds Dòrnait still didn't fully understand. But it was Fjord who stole her full attention. His presence was imposing, like an approaching storm, with blue eyes that shone like the sea on a clear day, yet with something darker lurking within them, something Dòrnait couldn't quite name. He stood there like a reflection of her own heart, vast, complicated, and unsettling. When he approached her, Dòrnait could barely contain her surprise. Her brother's embrace was tight, almost protective, but also distant, as if every gesture was steeped in untold memories. The familiarity of it moved her in a way she hadn't anticipated. The tension rose when Fjord mentioned their mother's absence. His words seemed to loosen the dam of long-held compassion, flooding the room with a shared sorrow that had never been spoken aloud. Dòrnait felt the weight of that grief press upon her, but she was steadied by Aodhgall's hand on her waist, a firm refuge. Despite her pain, she wasn't alone. The conversation flowed with a tangle of words and glances, each one measuring the other. Aodhgall, the cousin so feared for his severity, surprised Dòrnait with a tone that bordered on cordial. And yet, beneath the polite facade of these men, something else stirred in the air, something Dòrnait could not ignore. The fact that Fjord seemed skeptical of the story she'd told about her accident was just a small crack in the surface. His eyes didn't believe what his lips said, and neither did Aodhgall's. That interrogation from her brother was a sharp edge, brushing the truth without slicing it. Dòrnait understood that while she might offer excuses, she would not escape the scrutiny of her family. But something within her solidified when Aodhgall, with a defiant gesture and quiet voice, held her tighter than ever. "I realized I liked having Miss MacCuinn here with me," he said. It was a challenge, and the room fell into silence, as if everyone knew this was a declaration that went beyond what words could define. Dòrnait felt it inside her, a strength born from the depths of her being, a certainty as old as the land itself. Fjord, who had tensed the air with his gaze, seemed ready to withdraw his consent. But she would not yield. "I love him," she murmured with a firmness that surprised even herself. In her brother's eyes, which studied her with a blend of doubt and love, she saw surrender. The storm broke and stillness took its place. At last Furchar smiled, not before kissing her cheek, a gesture that felt as ancient as the ruins of the castle, as if he were stepping aside to let a new era begin. Then how can I oppose it? It's your decision. His voice finally was warm, like sunlight breaking through the clouds at last. With her brother's smile still lingering on her face, Dòrnait looked at Aodhgall. The battle was over, at least for now. But she knew this was only the calm before the storm, and in her chest, the echo of the sea's waves resounded like a warning, something she could not ignore. When the tension between the two men finally eased and calm returned to the room, Dòrnait excused herself with a slight nod. There was a trace of relief in her chest, as if the waters of a quiet lake were settling after the storm. The men, now absorbed in their cups of uisci bitha, seemed to need nothing more than the silence of the night to dissolve what remained in the air. Dòrnait walked down the corridor, the echo of her footsteps softly reverberating on the stone, while the sea wind slipped through the thick walls like a distant whisper heavy with salt and mystery. The night at Dunsagothan felt deep, wrapped in an aura of secrecy, as if the nearby mountains and the distant sea shared ancient secrets. The castle stood dark and solemn beneath the black sky, where the full moon mirrored itself in the waters of the fjord like a silver mirror. The pines on the cliffs swayed gently, their branches like fingers stroking the wind, and the murmur of the sea wove itself through the echoes of old legends. Dòrnait didn't need to search long to find Uranie and Roisiel. The girls were in the kitchen, amid the heat of the flames and the bustle of maids making the final preparations for the ceremony. Uranie, her laughter vibrant, was chatting with a young servant girl, while Roisiel gave instructions with the calm determination of a woman who had learned to be the pillar of her household. As she entered, the firelight made the velvet of her dress shimmer, a blue as dark as the deep waters of the fjord. Roisiel noticed her first, then Uranie, who stopped laughing the moment she saw the glow of the dress. "Dòrnait," exclaimed Uranie, her eyes bright with admiration. "You look dazzling. Where did you get such a dress?" Dòrnait smiled, remembering the disbelief on Aodhgall's face when, with his usual severity, he had ordered clothes to be brought for her. The last thing she expected was for him to think of such details, but apparently his nature was full of surprises. Still, she kept that thought to herself. "Your brother had it sent," Dòrnait replied, and saw the surprise and amusement flash across Uranie's face. "Really?" said Uranie, raising her eyebrows. "What did you do to make him think about dresses?" Dòrnait laughed softly. "That doesn't matter now." She looked at both of them with a conspiratorial air, and her voice took on a mysterious tone. "I have a surprise for you." Anticipation lit up in Uranie's eyes, while Roisiel, with her usual composure, smiled in expectation. "A surprise?" asked Uranie, unable to hide her excitement. Roisiel shot her a look, but Uranie, always impulsive, couldn't contain her curiosity. "Uranie," said Roisiel, laughing gently. "It wouldn't be a surprise if she told you now." Dòrnait watched the small war of glances between the two girls, and couldn't help laughing. There was something charmingly genuine in the sisterly bond between them. "Go up to your rooms, and you'll see what it is," she told them with an enigmatic smile. The three of them went upstairs, and when Dòrnait entered the small room in the tower, she was surprised by the abundance of dresses there. Throughout her life she had known very little luxury, but in that moment, surrounded by fine fabrics and rich embroidery, she understood the difference between scarcity and abundance, and how Aodhgall's generosity had begun to shape her new world. With a look of affection, she set about choosing the dresses that, once worn by them, would feel like a second skin. Uranie, upon seeing the pile of dresses, ran toward them without a second thought, and Dòrnait watched her, knowing that overflowing energy was part of the youth still alive in her sister. "Uranie has no patience," said Roisiel, observing the commotion with a calm smile. "It's something we share," replied Dòrnait, glancing at her friend and seeing Roisiel's smile brighten even more. There was a new light in Roisiel's eyes, something Dòrnait hadn't seen there in a long time. She looked at her intently. "It's good to see you smile like that, Roisiel," she said warmly. Roisiel looked away, blushing, and her silence was a confirmation of what was stirring in her heart. Dòrnait could sense that something important was about to be shared, and her intuition told her Roisiel was on the verge of revealing something deeply personal. "I wasn't supposed to say anything until tomorrow," Roisiel began, nervous but excited. Dòrnait tensed, a soft breath escaping her lips as her gaze locked with Roisiel's. "Say what?" she asked, curiosity and joy coloring her voice. The tears shimmering in Roisiel's eyes were like a spark that lit a fire in her chest. Roisiel looked at her, unable to hide her emotion. "My brother has changed his mind. He's going to let Coanich court me, and if we still feel the same, he'll give us permission to marry." Dòrnait embraced her tightly, feeling the warmth of love in that small gesture. Roisiel's joy overflowed, and Dòrnait, feeling it so close, couldn't help the smile of pride and happiness that rose to her lips. "Oh, Roisiel, that's wonderful." She squeezed her hand with the gentleness of true friendship. "I'm so happy to see you like this." Roisiel smiled widely, her eyes filled with gratitude. "It is. And it's all thanks to you, Dòrnait." She looked at her friend with sincerity. "Thank you for helping me believe in what we felt." Dòrnait shook her head, smiling. "I didn't do anything. What you and Coanich have is real, and your brother has always wanted the best for you. He just needed to see it." She looked at Roisiel with affection. "And I know you'll be happy." The joy of that small victory made the night feel a little warmer, closer to the love and peace that had once seemed so far away. Dòrnait felt that after everything, the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. After the wedding, everything would be perfect. Chapter 33. The sea breeze, heavy with salt and mystery, drifted softly through the castle windows, where the candlelight cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The sea roared in the distance, like an ancient echo mingling with the whispers of the wind among the cliffs. Dunbray Castle stood in solemn stillness, a witness to old stories of love and power. In the great sitting room, where the echoes of conversation still lingered in the air, Aodhgall felt something inside him ease, as though the storm within had calmed, if only for a moment. Fjord had accepted Dorna's marriage, unnecessary but appreciated. The day of the wedding would be easier, at least for her. Marriage law in Scotland had always been a grey area. Despite the Church's disapproval of irregular unions, practice often differed. A public declaration followed by consummation was enough to make a marriage valid. Aodhgall didn't trust anything uncertain, which was why he planned to secure the marriage with Dòrnait that very night. He wouldn't risk Fjord changing his mind later. A thought that turned his stomach, but one he had to accept. As he reflected in the stillness of the room, the door closed softly behind Dòrnait, who had left to prepare for dinner. Aodhgall knew the calm wouldn't last. As soon as the door shut, Fjord turned to him, his look no longer cordial but edged with expectation and steel. "Now tell me what really happened," said Fjord, his voice echoing like a warning through the castle's silence. Aodhgall considered lying, but respect for his old friend stopped him. He couldn't deceive him, even if it meant facing Fjord's fury. Still, he wouldn't reveal everything. He wouldn't speak of the pact with Aodhgall, but he'd say enough to halt further questions for now. He cast a fleeting glance at Aodhgall, who remained silent, watching with a flicker of interest. Then, without breaking eye contact with Fjord, he spoke calmly. "It wasn't an accident. My men stopped her carriage." The cordiality vanished from the heavy air of the room. Fjord stiffened, and the atmosphere filled with a silence sharp as a blade. "You kidnapped my sister?" Fjord's question fell like a stone into water, sending a tremor through Aodhgall's soul. There was no good way to answer that. Aodhgall remained silent, letting the tension stretch between them. His breathing grew heavier as Fjord's fury flared in his eyes. Fjord clenched his jaw, holding back the volcano of anger that threatened to erupt. The tension was palpable, as though the old bonds of friendship were straining to their limit. "Why? Furchar asked, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. Aodhgall met his gaze, knowing that their long friendship was the only thing keeping Furchar from drawing his blade. But the truth had to come out, even if incomplete. "I wanted her to be mine," he said, the weight of the words filling the space between them. Furchar's contained fury sharpened in his features. His voice shook slightly with rage. "If you forced her, you're as good as dead," he said, every word like a sentence passed. The pressure of the moment was stripping away his composure. "You know me better than that," Aodhgall replied, with a seriousness that made it clear there had been no cruelty in his actions, only a firm resolve. Furchar stared at him. Despite everything, there was something in Aodhgall's words that struck true. "Why didn't you come to me directly? You know I would have supported your marriage." Aodhgall closed his eyes briefly, the question weighing heavily on him. Somewhere in his mind, he had already prepared for this conversation. He couldn't lie to Furchar. "That's exactly why I didn't. I'd heard Dòrnait was strong-willed and against arranged marriages. I thought a direct approach wouldn't work." A pause. "I figured a less conventional path might be more effective." Furchar let out a heavy sigh, as if he understood the truth behind Aodhgall's strategy. He didn't argue further, though the resentment still smoldered beneath the surface. "How did you know where she'd be?" he finally asked, a trace of suspicion in his voice. Aodhgall explained Dòrnait's escape to marry Lord Finlage, omitting the details of how he'd found out, leaving that for another time. Furchar cursed under his breath, his face darkening at the mention of Lord Finlage. Aodhgall knew Furchar disliked the man too. "The little rogue," he muttered, a bitter laugh escaping him. Aodhgall, who had remained silent until then, watched the scene with a glint of satisfaction, clearly pleased with how Aodhgall was handling things. At last he spoke. "Perhaps Rùm's method was primitive," he said with calculated calm, "but you can't deny it worked. They make a good match, and it's clear the girl loves him." Furchar narrowed his eyes at him. Aodhgall had overstepped, inserting himself into a conversation where he didn't belong. Furchar suspected something more was at play. Aodhgall's presence was no coincidence. But for now, he let the matter drop. "The only reason I'm not questioning you further is because I'm certain my sister is marrying you of her own free will," he said, his anger subdued but the distrust still present. "But before I leave this place, I will know the whole story." Aodhgall nodded, knowing that none of it mattered anymore. By then, everything would be done, and the pieces already in place. Chapter 34. The sun had risen early over the horizon, casting its light over the vast expanse of sea stretching beyond the cliffs, where the waves crashed fiercely against the rocks like an ancient Celtic chant, full of secrets and forgotten promises. The golden light filtered through the window panes of Dòrnait's room, bathing the space in a soft warmth that barely dispelled the chill surrounding her. Dòrnait woke, her body still wrapped in the cold of the departed night, but it was the emptiness beside her that truly froze her soul. She reached out into the darkness, searching for the warmth she had come to find in Aodhgall, but her hand met only the cold fabric of the sheets. Panic seized her for a fleeting moment, a knot in her stomach making her fear the worst. But the memory of the previous night soon caught up with her, dissolving the anxiety that had crept in. They had been united in body, yes, but with the restraint the situation demanded. Aodhgall had returned to his own chamber after their encounter, a gesture of respect toward his cousin and her brother. It was the first night they hadn't spent together since she agreed to marry him, and a strange sense of loneliness crept over her. She hadn't realized how deeply she missed him. That thought brought a gentle smile to her lips. It had been a special night, one in which Aodhgall had been tender, prolonging each moment of intimacy with a delicacy that had stolen her breath. The intensity of his gaze as they were together, that look that seemed to pierce straight through her, made her heart beat to a rhythm not her own. From this day forward they would be bound, irrevocably, forever. The excitement of that thought filled her with anticipation, and for a moment she forgot the uncertainty that surrounded her. She rose quickly from bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, and immediately regretted not putting on her shoes. The morning air, laced with the freshness of the nearby marshland, wrapped around her as she moved toward the window. The sun was already high in the sky, telling her she had slept longer than planned. The wedding ceremony would be brief, a simple event that would end in a feast stretching well into the night. This day would mark her fate, sealed in the church's rituals, in the warmth of promises, and the joy of gathered family. The sound of half-packed trunks reminded her there was still much to do. Celia's would arrive soon to help with the preparations, so there was no time to waste. As she sifted through her sister Roisel's and Urani's clothes, a flicker of joy crossed her mind as she recalled the previous evening's dinner. Aodhgall had delighted the girls with a gift, and the look in Coanich's eyes as he saw Roisil. Dòrnait couldn't help but smile at the image of her brother, so clearly taken with the young woman, so full of an innocent hope that seemed far removed from the fears lingering in her own heart. The air, full of the sea's fragrance and the crisp scent of the nearby hills, seemed to invite them all to live fully. Yet a darker thought crept into her mind as she remembered Aodhgall. There had been something in his behavior that night that unsettled her. It felt as though he were carrying something he hadn't told her, an invisible weight that pulled him away at times. She knew he disliked deceit, that he was an honest man, but she also understood that everything had been so carefully orchestrated, it couldn't have been coincidence. As she bent to close the trunk, something crunched beneath her foot. A piece of parchment lay near the door. Her curiosity sparked immediately, and as she bent to pick it up, she instantly recognized the seal, the MacCraith of Cradmer. Her fingers paused on the paper, a shadow of doubt crossing her face. What did Terbert want? Why had the letter been left here, now, at such a fragile moment? Without much thought, she broke the seal and began to read. The text, written in haste, chilled her to the core. Forgive me if my attempt to rescue you frightened you. All I wanted was to get you to safety. I know what Rùm is planning, and you must not marry him. He's deceiving you. My men will be watching the castle gates, in case you need them. Your brother, Terbert. Dòrnait read the letter twice, the knot in her throat tightening with every word. What did all of this mean? Was the enmity between Aodhgall and Terbert so deep that the truth had become twisted in a game of shadows and mistrust? She couldn't believe such vague warnings, yet something inside her kept questioning how the letter had found its way into her room, especially without anyone noticing. Did Aodhgall have a spy among his men? Anguish mingled with confusion, and Dòrnait looked once more toward the window, the sea shimmering on the horizon with a clarity that seemed to mock her turmoil. She had little time to decide, but she couldn't ignore the warning. If she left immediately, she might still reach Aodhgall before he and Fjord signed the marriage contract. Resolved, she quickly dressed in Roisel's simple gown, the easiest to put on, and stepped into the cold morning, ready to face whatever was necessary. Dunbray Castle, with its stone walls draped in moss and its shadows stretched by the sunlight, watched her in silence, like a mute witness to the decisions that were about to be made. The salty sea air lashed against the walls of Dunbray Castle, carrying with it the chill of the waves crashing against the rocks. The ocean breeze seemed to whisper secrets that only the old Celtic gods still heeded, while the grey sky loomed over the island. The castle, made of dark stone and surrounded by thick cliffs, stood like an unshakable fortress in the face of the storm gathering over the lives within its walls. Aodhgall let out a quiet sigh of relief as Torcall MacCuinn signed his name next to his on the parchment scroll. It marked the end of one part of the bargain, but the weight of what was yet to come still hung over him like the fog clinging to the coast. After the events of the previous night, everything about the wedding had been reduced to a mere formality. Though Dòrnait didn't know it yet, the old laws of Scotland had already bound them in marriage without ceremony. The scratch of the quill on parchment faded into the air, but in Aodhgall's chest the echo of past choices still reverberated. That signature ensured his brother's freedom, but it also made him heir to a wealth he could not ignore. Still, his heart was troubled with doubt. Dòrnait would soon learn the truth, And although he knew his brother would be released, the guilt over the pain that was coming tormented him. After offering his congratulations, Furchar excused himself to attend to matters before the ceremony, leaving Aodhgall alone with Aodhgall. This was the moment he had been waiting for. There were no more preambles to hide behind. "Where is my brother?" he demanded, his voice deep and filled with impatience. Aodhgall, eyes sharp and calculating, offered nothing but a smirk. The man, dressed in silks that set him apart from the Highland warriors, was a master of power games. His cunning had led many into his traps. "I imagine he's been in the same place he's been for the last 2 months, Aodhgall replied, calmly taking a glass of claret. Aodhgall frowned. He wouldn't let Aodhgall play games with him. "Today is my wedding day." Aodhgall looked at him steadily, showing no sign of concern. Indeed. That man was playing him, and Aodhgall knew it. However, he wouldn't give in to the provocation. He knew that if he showed his anger, Aodhgall would exploit his vulnerability. The gaze they exchanged was a subtle dance of power, like tides slowly pulling the sand from the shore but never stopping their advance. "You heard what Dòrnait said. She's marrying me of her own will. I've kept my part of the bargain, so don't play games with me." Aodhgall couldn't help the harshness in his voice. Aodhgall raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Are you threatening me?" "Interpret it as you wish. I've kept my word, so keep yours. My brother will be freed today, as you promised." The Count didn't seem affected, but the tension in the air was palpable. Without saying another word, Aodhgall took out a sealed scroll bearing the royal seal that weighed on Fionnan's freedom. Aodhgall remained still, knowing that his brother's fate was finally in his hands. "This is an order to release your brother. After the ceremony, it will be yours." A weight lifted from Aodhgall's chest. At last his brother's release was secured. However, the deal with Aodhgall was still not complete. "And what about the rest of the deal?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the scroll. "That will take a bit more time," Aodhgall replied coldly. "The king needs to be sure you're willing to cooperate before making a decision about your castle." Aodhgall had already waited long enough. He didn't trust the king's justice. Once he and Dòrnait were married, he would use Furchar's influence to regain what was rightfully his. Aodhgall might try to smooth things over, but in that moment Aodhgall already had a plan in mind. Aodhgall studied him with a penetrating gaze, a flicker of respect visible in his eyes. "I must admit you've impressed me, Rùm. I never thought you'd manage to pull it off." Dòrnait from outside heard the men's voices, and something in her chest stopped her from entering. She was out of sight, hidden in the shadows of the ancient fortress, where the stone walls seemed to echo with the shadows of the past. The tide was rising in the distance, and the sound of the wind hitting the battlements was like a forewarning of what was to come. Her cousin, with his venomous tone, interrupted her thoughts. "My little cousin has resisted every man I've put before her, yet you've managed to persuade her. How did you do it?" "It's none of your business," Aodhgall replied, his voice deep like thunder in the storm. "I did it without forcing her. That's all you need to know." Dòrnait, unable to help herself, took a step back, her heart pounding as her mind tangled with her cousin's words. Something wasn't right. Something she didn't want to see. Something that filled her with fear. And then Aodhgall's words reached her, striking her soul like a cold wind. "Of course she knows nothing about our arrangement. But I'll tell her everything as soon as my brother is safe." The coastal wind roared in her ears, and a wave of confusion swept over her. She sat against the wall, the icy air of the corridor slapping her face, but nothing could cool the burn of humiliation rising in her chest. With a trembling hand, she pulled out the piece of parchment she had once discarded as meaningless, slipping it beneath her skirt, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. When she stood before Aodhgall, something in his eyes shifted. He was no longer the man she had known. His gaze no longer held the promise of sincere love, but the cold gleam of a betrayal fulfilled. He was no longer someone she could trust. He was a stranger. And she, a pawn on a chessboard she had never agreed to play on. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone uneasy. Dòrnait, her voice breaking, asked the question she already feared she knew the answer to. "What were you talking about with my cousin? What deal have you made with him?" The silence between them was heavier than the fog blanketing the island. At last Aodhgall let the words fall, cutting through the air like knives. "You heard it." He showed no emotion. And in that instant, Dòrnait knew the truth. The marriage, the engagement, everything she had believed in had been a lie. Just a bargaining chip. A piece moved for their own ends. She staggered under the weight of the brutal revelation, while the coast roared, and the castle seemed to echo with the sound of his betrayal. Chapter 35. If my soul had a voice. If my soul had a voice, it wouldn't speak with words, but with the wind that wraps your name in the waves. It would be the ancient echo that calls you through the cliffs. When you think you are alone, but the sea still watches over you. I don't know the exact moment love conquered me. Perhaps it was your fury, perhaps your silence. But in your eyes I saw the storm roaring, and knew that nothing in me would remain unscathed. I don't want you to love me out of duty or fate, nor because of the shadow of a myth that still haunts us. I just want that one day, without fear or wounds, you take my hand and say, "Here at last I rest." The sea breeze slipped through the windows of the great hall, carrying the salt of the ocean, and the distant roar of waves crashing against the cliffs. The storm brewing on the horizon seemed to mirror the one surging within Aodhgall's soul. Standing before Dòrnait, chilled to the bone by her indifference, he felt struck not only by the wind, but by her words, her accusations, the boundless wound of a love turned to ash. Dòrnait's skin looked carved from stone, pale and lifeless. Her eyes, once so bright, were now dulled by a deep sadness, as though the sea itself had swallowed everything that once made her shine. Aodhgall watched her, a knot in his throat, his heart imprisoned in a cage of iron. He knew he had made the greatest mistake of his life, but he also knew he had no choice. The fight to save his brother had dragged him to this place, and if he had to pay with his soul, so be it. The air in the castle was heavy with a tension only time might dissolve, but Aodhgall had no time. The walls of the fortress, raised through centuries of history, seemed to have absorbed his anguish. Through the tall windows the Scottish horizon was visible, where the sea clashed endlessly against the land. The mist rising from the water looked like a veil, concealing the emotions of all present, including the two of them. "I love you," he said at last, his voice broken, as though the words were the last thing that could save him. It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but this time the pain pierced him like an arrow. Dòrnait didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on some faraway point, as if searching for answers in the waves crashing against the shore. What could she say? Love wasn't enough. Not when shadows of betrayal hung so heavily around her, when the weight of lies crushed her chest. "Love?" she asked, her tone dry, stripped of the softness it once held. Her eyes, usually so clear and luminous, now reflected the storm overflowing in her heart. She didn't look at him, didn't touch him. The air between them was an abyss widening with every word he spoke. The silence was heavier than the stones surrounding the castle. Dòrnait pulled away from him with the same calm as a river flowing to its fate, cold and relentless. Yet her soul burned. "You didn't love me enough to tell me the truth," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with the venom forged in hours of lonely despair. Aodhgall stared at her, watching his words vanish like smoke. He wanted to scream, but his throat was closed, choked with frustration, remorse, and helplessness. "The truth," he began, but his voice faltered. What could he say? That he had done it all to protect her, to save her from a fate she couldn't understand. He couldn't keep lying, but he didn't know how to tell the truth without destroying what little still bound them together. Dòrnait turned slowly to face him, her expression a mask of cold resolve. And as if his words couldn't pierce her armor, she replied with lethal calm. "Then you leave me alone with this burden?" Her words were as sharp as a blade. What you've done to me, it won't be forgotten. Not even the wind can erase what you've sown between us." The celebration around them went on like a distant echo, blind to the weight of what was unfolding in that room. Laughter, bagpipes, the beat of drums blended with the song of the waves, but Dòrnait no longer heard any of it. She felt none of the music's rhythm, none of the warmth from the smiling faces. Everything was thick fog, like the one covering the coast, keeping her suspended between rage and heartbreak. The castle felt like a prison of stone, a grand refuge that could not shield her from the shadows in her mind. Her steps echoed down the hallway as she walked away from him, and Aodhgall could do nothing but stand there, frozen, watching the last remnants of his hope fall apart. She had been everything to him. Passion, fury, desire, and fear had tangled through his life, but now, like the old Celtic legends that spoke of betrayal and broken fates, he knew the sacrifice was inevitable. The sea roared in the distance, as though it too bore witness to his downfall. Dòrnait sat alone on one of the platforms, watching the parade of courtiers approach to offer their congratulations, their hollow words wrapped in false smiles. All eyes were on her, but she saw none of them. She was like a statue made of ice and isolation. Every word, every gesture, pushed her deeper into the desolation consuming her heart. But there was something else, something she could no longer ignore. The whispers that drifted through the hall, the rustle of fabric and fleeting glances, everything felt like a macabre game. Her brother's life, the weight of her duty, and above all the monster of her own pride, it was all a web she could no longer escape. When her cousin Aodhgall approached, his concern felt as false as his smile. He had no comfort for her, no answer to what she needed. But then Aodhgall came to her, his eyes as grave as the sea in winter. She looked at him for an instant, catching something in his gaze beyond the anger, something that still bound her to him. But she turned away, and in a whisper said what they both already knew was inevitable. "No matter how hard you try, I'll never be yours." Chapter 36. The moon rose above the castle, bathing the ancient stones in its silver light. From the ramparts, the sea roared like an old spirit whispering forgotten secrets to the wind. The wind, cold and soaked with the night's mist, slipped through the castle walls, carrying the ocean's salt as the landscape stretched into the distance, dark and mysterious. Aodhgall climbed the stairs toward Dòrnait's room, the sound of his steps echoing through the silence of the fortress. It was a steep staircase, its worn stones seeming to sing beneath his weight, as though the castle itself had a voice. The ceremony, brief but solemn, had taken place hours earlier, cloaked in an atmosphere of stillness and sorrow. Dòrnait, radiant in her golden gown, had walked the aisle like a distant figure, surrounded by the pomp her family and clan expected, but devoid of the vitality one might anticipate on such a meaningful day. The vows were spoken with a steady voice and empty eyes. The ritual, beautiful in its simplicity, passed quickly, like a sigh swallowed by the shadows. The night had been long, and the day had left a mark on him, one not easily erased. He had felt the weight of guilt like iron on his chest, but the order to release his brother Fionn had offered some relief, though fleeting from the torment gnawing at him. If all went well, his brother would return at dawn and the nightmare would be over. But that was only a flicker in the darkness, compared to the hollow ache in his heart. The uncertainty hanging over his marriage was a poison that had left him drained, without strength. Dòrnait had been his sun, his fire. And yet that day she had walked among them like a ghost, her soul so distant that Aodhgall doubted he would ever reach her again. The smiles she gave him were like poisoned daggers, and each indifferent gesture pushed her further from him. He knew it, but he couldn't bear it. He had longed desperately to hold her, to soothe her, to make her feel that everything would be all right, but her presence had become unbearable. Every word, every glance of rejection was a wall rising higher between them. And the worst part was he had no idea how to tear it down. The image of Dòrnait that night was burned into his mind, her golden gown shimmering in the candlelight, her hair adorned with jeweled pins, yet she looked more fragile than ever, like a crystal fairy on the verge of shattering. The sight of her delicate form overwhelmed him, as if a single breath of wind might break her apart. But it wasn't the dress or the ornaments that made her seem distant. It was her shut-off soul, her heart locked away with a key he couldn't find. The shoes he had given her lay discarded in some corner, like an offering refused. That rejection pierced his chest because he knew it wasn't just a gesture, it was a wound he had caused. And the worst part was, he couldn't fix it. Not the way he had hoped. As he reached her door, doubt gripped him for a brief moment. Should he let her rest? But the decision came quickly. No matter what had happened between them, they were now husband and wife, and nothing could change that. It was the vow he had made to her, and nothing would take her from his side. If Dòrnait didn't understand that yet, he would make sure she did. This was their wedding night, and he would not allow the distance to grow further. With a determination that surprised even himself, he knocked on the door with force, the sound of his fist on the wood shattering the silence. Rage coursed through his veins, but so did need, the urgency to be near her. He gripped the handle tightly, ready to open the door, but it remained locked. The cold metal bit into his palm, and a flash of frustration cut through his thoughts. Dòrnait had locked the door from the inside. Something broke within him. There was something so final, so cruel in that act that Aodhgall couldn't stop the fury rising in him. The idea of being so close to her, and yet so far, stole the breath from his lungs. It wasn't just the act of rejection, it was the silence behind it that was destroying him. He stood there, in front of the closed door, his soul hollow, eyes fixed on the darkness of the corridor. Outside, the storm over the sea roared, as though the ocean itself shared in his torment. The moon hung high in the sky, distant and cold, unable to light the abyss between them. And there, in that moment suspended between hope and despair, Aodhgall understood that what he had done could not be undone. Chapter 37. Dunbray Castle, Dunsagathon wedding night. She walks in beauty like the night of clear and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meets in her eyes and in her face. Lord Byron, she walks in beauty. Night had fallen over the northern cliffs like a shroud of ash and salt. The sea wind battered the castle towers with the roar of ancient gods, and the waves crashed against the rocks with the restrained fury of an omen. Inside, in the main chamber, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls draped in worn tapestries. A figure stood still by the flames, Dòrnait. The day had left a weight in her body like the burden of centuries. She had fallen asleep without meaning to, curled in a carved oak chair, the wedding dress still clinging to her skin like a memory she wanted to forget. The golden silk and embroidered velvet gleamed with a dim melancholy in the firelight. At her feet, the box with the shoes Aodhgall had given her remained untouched, like an offering refused. She had chosen humbler silk shoes instead. A small gesture, but heavy with meaning. She didn't know if he had noticed. And if he had, whether he cared or not was no longer her concern. She touched the silver amulet with the knot of light that hung from her neck, the Celtic knot intertwined with the cross of St. Columba. She had planned to give it to him that night, as a promise of eternal love. Now it was nothing but an echo of her mistake, a reminder of her mother, of her warning, of the curse that seemed to pass like a shadow through the bloodline of the women in her family. A knock at the door cut through her thoughts. A second blow, stronger, shook the iron hinges. Aodhgall's voice, deep and ragged like the storm, thundered from the other side. Dòrnait. Open the door. Now. She rose slowly. Her hands clenched into fists. No. A curse from the hallway. Then the handle rattled violently. Either you open it, or I break it down. Dòrnait looked at the iron bar sealing the door. The castle was old, its doors made to withstand sieges. It would take more than brute force to get through. Or so she thought. Leave. I don't want to see you tonight. Or tomorrow. Or ever. Silence. A thick silence, the kind Druid said came before disaster. Then suddenly the crash, splintering wood tearing iron. The door gave way as if it had been struck by Dagda himself, the Celtic god of strength. Aodhgall appeared in the doorway, his body casting a vast shadow across the stone floor. His face was taut with rage, but in his eyes burned something more complex: pain, desire, desperation. Those eyes, as blue as the waters of the fjord where he had nearly died to save her. "Don't ever shut me out again, Dòrnait," he growled. "I'm your husband." "By coercion." "By deceit," she replied, her voice like ice. He stepped forward, 3 strides bringing him face to face with her. He seemed a force of nature, a relic of a lineage born of stone and fire. His pulse beat like a war drum in his neck. "We were wed. We swore before God. That's the only truth that matters." "And your deal with Fjord and Aodhgall?" "My hand in exchange for your brother's freedom." Aodhgall didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Perfect," said Dòrnait. "You got what you wanted. Now leave." He grabbed her arm with controlled force, his fingers locking around her like shackles of flesh and desire. "What I want is you." Dòrnait tore herself free as if his touch had burned her. "Maybe you bought me, but you'll never own my will. There are things gold, not even the purest, can't buy." Aodhgall's face hardened. The silence between them stretched, tense like a rope about to snap. Then he pulled her to him. His body was hot, vibrant, alive. A drum beneath the skin. His chest was a wall offering no retreat. Dòrnait felt her will falter, dragged by forces older than reason. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice a dark incantation. Then he kissed her. It was a brutal kiss, as if he meant to conquer her, as if desire were a war and she a fortress under siege. Dòrnait resisted at first. But passion wrapped around her like moorland fog, dense, inescapable, dangerous. Her body betrayed her fury, her dignity, her pain. She gave in for a moment, for a single breath, and then broke away. "No," she gasped. "You're a brute. Just like my mother said. A savage with no soul and no honor." Aodhgall went pale. But she didn't stop. "How dare you touch me like that? I'm not your whore. You lied to me. Used me. And still you think I'll surrender to you." The accusation hit him deep. She saw him retreat half a step. That was all she needed. "Maybe I am a brute," he replied, voice rough. "But you want me. You're my wife." "Never," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Never's a long time, Dòrnait," he said with a dangerous calm. "But you'll understand. Sooner or later." Aodhgall turned and left, the broken door gaping behind him. Dòrnait remained alone, trembling, her breath uneven. She hated him. She wanted him. She feared him. She knew he would return. And that she couldn't hold out like this forever. But she wouldn't let him win. Not yet. The wind howled in the towers like a raven's cry. Outside, the sea broke harder against the cliffs. As if the old gods themselves were deciding her fate. Chapter 38. Echoes of war and sacrifice in the land of winds. At the break of dawn, the mist slowly unraveled over the cliffs that guarded the Sound of Aodhgall, revealing the imposing silhouette of Dunbray Castle rising from the coastline like a crown of stone. The bluish light of the morning, reflected in the restless waters, enveloped the towers in a spectral glow, as if the castle did not quite belong to this world, but to some veiled border between the human and the sacred. Aodhgall rode in silence, his sweat sticking his tunic to his body despite the biting cold nesting among the frost-covered heathers. They had ridden all night, leaving behind the stench and decay of Blackness Prison, and now his horse's legs trembled under the weight of exhaustion and urgency. Beside him, his brother Fionn rode. He was still just a boy, but the hell of imprisonment had marked him. He had lost the flesh of his face, his eyes had become deeper, and his hands, once lively with humor and bravado, now hung stiffly like a soldier who had survived too many battles. The bright fire that used to sparkle in his eyes was now a dead ember, and when he spoke, it was with the hollow voice of someone who had known the depths of betrayal. Aodhgall looked at him with sorrow. The guilt was a thorn deeply embedded. He had handed his brother over to King James as part of a deal, not foreseeing the poison of the court, nor the cruelty of a prison where even light prayed in whispers. Fionn had paid for his naivete, and Dòrnait. Dòrnait too. Her name surfaced as a whisper in his mind, as present as the salt in the sea air. The previous night now felt like a nightmare under the waning moon. He remembered the splintered wood of the door, the crackling of candles casting distorted shadows on her furious face, the heat of her body pressed against his, and above all the open wound of her words, "You'll have to force me." He had lost everything in that instant. Control, reason, and almost his soul. He had wanted her to understand, to see beyond the fury boiling beneath his skin, hardened by years of fighting. But he had taken her in his arms as though he could reclaim what had broken with force, and in his kiss there was no tenderness, only the fury of a wounded animal. Shame followed him like a second rider. He carried the sealed parchment with him, the document that legitimized his union with Dòrnait before law and God. But he had not yet delivered it to the pastor. Part of him wanted to cling to that last decision. If she wanted to leave, if she wanted to free herself, he would not raise walls or chains to hold her. Even if it tore his heart out. Fionn glanced at him sideways. "Are you really married?" Aodhgall nodded without looking at him. "Yes." Fionn furrowed his brow. "You don't seem very convinced." "I am," he said after a pause, "but maybe not for the reasons you think." A shadow crossed the young man's face, but at least it was no longer the mask of prison, but the natural doubt of a brother. "I'm sorry for what you did for me," he said, his voice hoarse. "But if she doesn't love you, you shouldn't." "It wasn't a sacrifice," Aodhgall interrupted softly. "Not entirely." The conversation was interrupted as the battlements of the castle took clear shape, and life stirred within its walls. The bustle of servants, the barking of hounds, the clashing of metal. But there was something more. Something discordant. It wasn't the cheerful bustle of a welcome, but the tense echo of a problem. They galloped the last few meters to the gates, where a whirlwind of dust and hooves announced their arrival. But the warmth of that moment died as they entered the courtyard. There, amidst haystacks and half-lit torches, Furchar was directing his men with a furrowed brow, the dagger held firmly in his hand, as though waiting for the charge of an enemy. Aodhgall was beside him, with the expression of a man who had just received a bad prophecy. Roisiel and Uranie rushed towards them. The former threw herself at Fionn, who froze under the weight of her embrace. It was then that Furchar took a step toward Aodhgall. "Give me a good reason not to kill you right here. What have you done to her?" The question fell like thunder. Aodhgall stood tall, trying to understand. "What happened?" Roisiel turned to him, her eyes red from crying. "She's gone," she said. "Dòrnait is gone." The world seemed to close around him, as if the sea that surrounded him suddenly rose and drowned him. She was gone. Dòrnait his wife. Dòrnait his damnation. Dòrnait his redemption. And guilt reached him like a cold wave from the Atlantic. He had broken the one thing he wished to protect. But it wouldn't be the end. Not for him nor for her. Because if there was one thing the old land of Scotland had taught him, it was that the deepest roots are the ones you cannot see. And beneath the weight of the earth and blood, redemption could still be there. And if he had to seek it to the farthest ends of the sea, or face the gods of the otherworld, so be it. Chapter 39. Coast of the Isle of Rùm. The boat rocked gently on the grey waters of the Atlantic, leaving behind a trail of white foam in the icy sea, and the shadowy profile of Dun Sagathan fading into the distance. As the Berlin drew closer to the small pier at Port Nassith, the dawn light bathed the island of Rùm in shades of mother-of-pearl and lavender, as if the land itself were waking from an ancient dream. The beaches stretched wide and deserted, with sand so white it looked like bone polished by time. Beyond, the moors breathed under a veil of bluish mist, dotted with purple heathers and autumn ferns. The wind, that incessant spirit that cuts through everything in the Hebrides, entangled itself in Dòrnait's layers, bringing to her face the sea salt and the scent of soaked moss. The whole world seemed to sigh, and with it her heart. Dòrnait stood at the prow unmoving, wrapped in her thick woolen cloak. In silence she watched as a white seal slid over the rocks, as if emerging from the folklore of her childhood. The creature looked at her for a moment still, as if recognizing in her one of its own, a creature torn between land and sea. This place, she thought with a pang of pain, could have been her home. But it would not be. Not now. Her brother's castle loomed ahead, severe and rough, as though it had been ripped from the very stone of the island. It did not possess the romantic majesty of Dun Sagothan, but it exhaled a primal strength, as though the ancient Celtic deities still protected it. It was a place of exile, not belonging. Since she had discovered the truth, the letter, the deal, the betrayal, she had found no rest. Her mind spun like a cursed wheel, reliving over and over that moment when she realized Aodhgall had not trusted her, not even to decide her own fate. Rage had not sustained her for long. Soon it gave way to a sadness so deep and voracious that it threatened to consume her from within. Aodhgall. His name echoed inside her like a cursed prayer, blending love and desolation. She had loved him, God, she still loved him, but she could not stay, not after what had happened between them, after what their lips had spoken in the shadows of the tower. That kiss, that touch of death and desire. She had had to flee before she succumbed, before her will drowned under the tide of her own weakness. She could not allow him that power. She could not keep desiring him. The plan was simple. The healer Ceannfhionn, thirsty for an old love and perhaps not forgotten, had agreed to help. Dòrnait had taken advantage of Aodhgall's absence and escaped in the shadows of the dawn. She had felt a moment of doubt then, an overwhelming weight that paralyzed her legs and darkened her chest, but she forced herself to move forward, not looking back. And now she was here, once more under a Scottish sky that seemed on the verge of raining forever. As she reached the shore, she saw a man on a dark-coated horse. She straightened up as she recognized the figure. It was her brother Dòrnait MacCraith, Baron of Rùm, and the reason for her flight. He resembled Aodhgall, yes, but like shadows resemble the bodies that cast them, stiffer, harder, more distant. He dismounted with the same martial gravity as her brother-in-law, and stood before her, arms crossed. His eyes, steel gray, measured her without blinking. "You've come," he said, without embellishment or warmth. "Good. I feared you'd disappoint me." The words froze her soul. She didn't know what she had expected. Perhaps a warm hand, a comforting phrase. Not that coldness, like the edge of a winter blade. Not that hidden disapproval. "I'm glad to see you, brother," she whispered, feeling her throat tighten. Something softened in his face, as if, despite his harshness, he was not entirely foreign to suffering. He reached out his hand, and she took it with trembling fingers. "Come. Rest. We'll talk later." As they walked together toward the castle, Dòrnait looked up at the sky, hoping that some sign, a crow, a beam of light, a omen would reveal that she had made the right decision. But she only found the low clouds of the Atlantic, and the distant caw of a flock of seagulls. And still inside something was breaking. She knew that even if she annulled the marriage, even if she freed herself legally, she would never erase Aodhgall from her memory. He lived in her skin, in her thoughts, in the dreams that would now be a curse. But at least now, as the castle gates opened to receive her, she would have time. Time to cry, to heal, and perhaps one day to forgive. A fog as thick as an unfulfilled promise spread over the cliffs of Cradmer, where the sea slammed with muffled fury against the blackened rock. The seagulls flew over the battlements with sharp cries, like lost souls that could find no rest. The west wind, heavy with salt and fate, slipped through the cracks in the castle walls, whispering ancient stories in a tongue older than man. Dòrnait sat up slowly, her body numb, her soul even more so. For a brief moment, she thought she was in Dun Sagothan, with its meadows dotted with flowers and the fresh scent of lavender on the hills. But the illusion shattered as the door creaked open with a rusty groan, and a pale-faced maid entered with a steaming jug of water. "I've set the table for lunch," the woman announced in a hollow voice detached from all joy. She was a gaunt woman, with sunken eyes and a resigned expression that would not have looked out of place in a painting of the Sorrowful Virgin. Her name was Sorsa, and there was a sadness about her that seemed ancestral, as though she carried not only the present but all the past winters of the castle. The lord moved away from them, while Sorsa helped her dress in the wrinkled, still mud-stained gown. Dòrnait felt a pang of sorrow. She washed her face with cold water, not to wake herself, but as though she were trying to erase something deeper, the weight of her choices. They walked in silence through the hallways of Cradmer, and it didn't take long for Dòrnait to notice the contrast with the living warmth of Dun Sagathan. This fortress was an old and wounded body, its walls resonating with a silence that hurt. The soul of the castle was sick, and the spirit of those who lived there consumed by shadow. Sorsa avoided her gaze. Dòrnait tried. "Have you been here long?" she asked. "Yes." "So, you didn't come with my brother from Dun Sagathan?" "No." The exclamation was almost a spit, a flash of hatred that sprang like water from a cursed spring. Dòrnait fell silent. She understood. She too felt like a traitor. She had left her husband. She had given herself to Terbert, thinking she was doing the right thing, and now she didn't even know who she was. She couldn't explain it to anyone, not even to herself. The great hall had the coldness of a tomb. The tapestries, though still hanging from the walls, seemed like tatters of a past glory. The iron of the chandeliers was covered in soot and melted wax. The tables were solid, but the hands that had carved them were long buried underground. Terbert didn't bother to stand when Dòrnait entered. He ate with the same efficiency with which he would kill, without passion but with purpose. His eyes followed her with curiosity. Not as a brother seeing his sister again, but as a hunter appraising the prey that had fallen from the sky. "You don't look like our mother," he commented, after a pause filled with ambiguity. Dòrnait felt as though an invisible blanket had been lifted from her. The emotional cold of this place crept into her bones. "But you do," she said with effort, recognizing in him that curve in the mouth, that emerald fire in the eyes. Terbert seemed taken aback, then shrugged. "I spent too many years without seeing her." As they spoke, the story of their mother and the man she had married began to take shape, like a figure emerging from dark water. Torcall MacCraith. The enemy. The traitor. The slain husband. "Did you kill him?" "He crossed his limits," he said, with an indifference crueler than any threat. Dòrnait felt nausea rise. Her mother, betrayed by her own son, had kept quiet for her sake. To protect her. So she could love her brother without poison in her heart. And her. Hadn't she done the opposite with Aodhgall? She tried to push the thought aside, but doubt had already taken root. "Did you orchestrate my escape with Lord Finlage?" Terbert's smile was like the edge of a dagger, sliding through the throat with terrifying calm. "Yes. And it would have worked if Rùm hadn't interfered." Everything became clear. She was nothing but a piece in his chess game. Lord Finlage, the king, the dowry, the influence. Everything wove a web of which Dòrnait only now saw the threads. And in the middle of that spider's web, her. "I won't marry him," she said, her voice trembling. "You will, little sister." And when he said it, Dòrnait believed him. His voice was a command forged in stone and blood. She felt the same shiver one must feel when seeing a mythical creature emerge from the forest, beauty and terror mixed in a creature whose will was law. It was then that Terbert noticed the amulet. He took it without asking. The silver piece carved with Celtic runes and an almost invisible inscription, Aodhgall MacCraith, the Angel of the Rock. "The Rock of the Lady," he murmured. "It's the ancient symbol of the Cambrach. This is more valuable than you think." "What does it mean?" But his laugh, deep and ancient like the echo in a forgotten cave, offered no answer. It was the laugh of someone who had just remembered a prophecy. Or of someone who had just placed the final piece of a long-formed plan. And deep within the castle, where the stones still remembered the pagan rites under the watchful eye of Christ, where the old Celtic goddesses still whispered to those who knew how to listen, something stirred. The story was not over. It was waking. Chapter 40. Where blood and salt meet. It had taken Aodhgall all morning to gather his men, and even more to contain the fire in Torcall MacCuinn's eyes, who had nearly challenged him to a duel right there in the courtyard of the old priory of Krieg and Dòrnait. They were barely 100, counting a dozen of Torcall's swordsmen, hardened in the tides of Skye, who had come to Aodhgall as an escort to a wedding that now seemed like an omen. There was no time to call more men. Although Tuathla Cambrach had nearly 400 warriors, half of them were scattered through the villages in the south. Rùm was giving them, for now, a chance. The sky was covered in low clouds that crawled like mist over the Hebrides Sea, and the air was thick with the smell of wet peat, as if the very spirit of the land were watching them. "If you're wrong about this," Torcall growled as they tied the Berlin to the dock at Krieg and Dòrnait, "I'll take my men back to Dunvegan, after you and I settle our differences with steel." "I'm not wrong," Aodhgall replied with a firmness that didn't quite reach his soul. Dòrnait was furious. It was an impulsive decision to seek refuge with Tuathla, but I know she regrets it. She'll want to return. "Knowing that bastard Tuathla, you're probably right," Torcall muttered. "But about the validity of that marriage of yours, I have my doubts." Aodhgall fell silent. He wanted to raise his voice, defend what he felt to be a vow before God and the ancestors, but he knew Torcall was right. No matter how every fiber of his being screamed that Dòrnait was his, she was the one who had to decide. "I won't ask for the marriage to be recognized if she doesn't want it," he finally said. "You can swear it on St. Columba that you won't," Torcall replied, his voice harsh but less heated. It was a miracle they hadn't already fought. The only thing that had held Torcall's fury in check was Aodhgall's sincere confession that he loved his sister with a devotion he couldn't put into words. If they were to cross swords, they would be evenly matched. Torcall was stronger, but Aodhgall was faster. Neither of them wanted to find out which attribute would weigh more. The beach was unsettlingly empty. The group took their time disembarking, and unease turned to distrust. There were no sentries, no patrols, not even a drunken old man shouting a warning. The dry nets hung like specters from the beached boats. Even the seagulls seemed to have abandoned the harbor. "Where the hell is the welcoming committee?" Torcall murmured half mockingly, half alarmed. "I don't know," Aodhgall replied, scanning the promontory. "But I don't like it." "Neither do I." They walked south, following the dirt path speckled with nettles and saltgrass. The wind blew from the west, bringing with it the deep roar of the sea and the bitter scent of seaweed. The silhouette of Cradmer, the old fortress, rose among the birches like a blackened tooth of granite in the thick underbrush. Its walls were covered in green and gold lichen, as though the land itself wanted to reclaim it. That's where they saw him. Tuathla Cambrach was waiting for them at the door, standing with the arrogance of a laird confident in his power. Behind him, barely 20 men. The rest, Aodhgall suspected, were hidden behind the battlements or crouching in the arrow slits, like wolves waiting for the moment to strike. Tuathla's face was a mask of contempt. "You have something that belongs to me," Aodhgall said as he stepped forward. "Your castle." Tuathla laughed. "I'm afraid I can't return that. It has a lovely view." "No, my wife." Tuathla narrowed his eyes, as if pretending not to understand. "You mean my sister?" "I'm sorry, I can't return her either," he said with a twisted smile. "Unless you know how to swim." He raised his arm and pointed toward the sea. Aodhgall turned. And the world seemed to stop. Less than 200 meters from the shore, perched on a rocky outcrop barely visible among the waves, stood Dòrnait. Her clothes whipped like a torn flag, and her wet hair fell in dark strands over her face. The sea surrounded her like a wolf circling a wounded deer. Time seemed to slow, like in a nightmare where your legs won't move. The tide was rising, and with it the danger. Aodhgall barely heard Fchar curse under his breath. And then he understood. The line of Terbert's men wasn't at the castle but behind them, stretched along the beach blocking the way. There were more than 200, steady as a wall of flesh and steel. They had been caught in a subtle, silent trap, like the ones the ancient city set, lurking in the hills and playing with mortals. Aodhgall felt the weight of the decision pressed down on his chest. There was no time for doubt. Only one cruel, clear truth as sharp as steel. If he didn't reach Dòrnait before the tide swallowed her, he would lose her forever. Dòrnait on the Lady's Rock. Western Scotland, coast of Rùm, in the year of our Lord 1610. The sea roared like a hungry god. The salt burned her skin, and the wind lashed at her face like invisible whips tearing at strands of her wet hair. Dòrnait Cambrach had never felt such fear. The cold seeped into her bones, and the white shirt she wore, clinging to her body like the shroud of a martyred saint, offered no defense against the fury of the waters. She shivered, digging her fingers into the rock as if they could hold back the tide. She seemed like a figure ripped from a tragic ballad, one of those that the old women of the clan would sing by the fire, about maidens doomed to die by the sea. But Dòrnait was no innocent maiden, nor did she intend to resign herself. Another wave rose from the abyss, enormous, furious with the thunder of a city horse. She held her breath and turned her face just before it broke over her, hitting her with brutal force. Her fingers slipped for a moment. Panic burned her chest. But she managed to grip again, gasping, as her heart beat like a war drum. "Lord have mercy," she murmured in a hoarse voice, barely audible. The waters surrounding her were not the sweet ones of the Pool of Sighs, where the clan's children learned to swim under the watchful eyes of the gentle nymphs. Here everything was hostile. An endless abyss, dark as the night of Samhain. And as the tide rose, Dòrnait felt herself sinking into a world where men no longer ruled, but ancient spirits and the furies of water. She thought of Tuathla Cambrach, the ancestor who had died in that very place, abandoned by a vengeful laird centuries ago. She had always considered her a legend. But now on that slippery and solitary rock, she understood the truth that the history concealed. It was not a myth. It was pain. It was fear. It was the certainty of a slow death while the shore and those who could save you remained desperately far away. Is this how she felt? Was she this alone? She was perched on a sharp stone point like a fang, a remnant of the last glacial rage. There was nowhere to place her feet without risk of slipping, so she clung to the rock like a penitent to her cross, her nails broken, her muscles burning. The castle loomed behind her, a black silhouette against the clouds, and she could make out Terbert on the battlements, shouting orders with his usual bravado. Even from there, Dòrnait could see the emotion on his face. He was a cruel child enjoying breaking a toy. She had thought he was joking when he spoke of the Lady's Rock. When he ordered her to remove her dress, she believed he just wanted to humiliate her. But upon seeing the boat, feeling the hands dragging her, hearing the silence of the men, that silence that announces the inevitable, she understood the truth. Her brother was capable of this. And more. She fought, kicked, screamed until her voice was raw. It did no good. Half a dozen men roughly shoved her onto the berlin as if she were an offering to the gods of the sea. "They won't harm you," Terbert had said. "If Aodhgall cooperates." But what if he didn't? What if the wounded pride that she herself had inflicted on him weighed more than love? Aodhgall. Guilt surged up her throat like bile. She realized how unfair she had been. Aodhgall was not like her brother. He had never been. He had acted as a leader, yes, keeping things from her, yes, but he had done so for a greater purpose. His duty was not driven by greed, but by the need to protect. She, on the other hand, had fled. She had abandoned him on their wedding night, rejecting not just a husband but a man who loved her. She had been afraid of becoming her mother. But now she saw what she had never seen before. Her mother had never been loved. Dòrnait had been. and she had cast that love into the sea as one throws a stone, and hopes not to hear the splash. She cried. Not out of fear nor from the cold. She cried out of regret. Hope had almost faded completely when she saw the silhouettes appear on the path from the castle, moving like a war procession. Armed men, and at the front, him. Aodhgall. Dòrnait recognized him instantly, even from a distance. He wore the golden mail of the chief, woven with threads that caught the light like a halo. His sword hung at his side, and the polished helmet gleamed like a promise. But it wasn't the attire that made her tremble, it was his face. Hard. Beautiful. Determined. And for an eternal moment their eyes met. She knew then, as a daughter of the clan knows when the ground trembles beneath her feet before a landslide. He had come for her. Her heart skipped a beat. The sea continued to roar, but for the first time Dòrnait stopped hearing it. There was only the man running to the edge of the world to save her. And the sea, the ancient Celtic sea with its secrets and its dead, was preparing to judge whether love was stronger than the fury of the waters. Chapter 41. The Sacrifice on the Lady's Rock. Island of Rùm, Scotland. Sunset of a day in the year of our Lord 1610. The sun bled out behind the horizon, staining the sky scarlet and gold like a spilled chalice over the vastness of the sea. The air, heavy with salt and the ancient breath of the oceans, grew colder, denser, as if the gods of the deep were holding their breath. And amid that living, roaring expanse, two gazes met. Through the trembling strip of raging sea, Aodhgall's eyes found Dòrnait's. The world seemed to stop. Amid the crash of waves and the howl of the wind, that crossing of souls was clearer than any words. Under the amber light of dusk, Aodhgall stood still, a stone statue carved by sorrow. Dòrnait, her lips purple from the cold, would have sworn she saw him pale. That face, she knew it. She had seen it before, years ago, when she had fallen into the fjord and he had rescued her with hands bloodied by the thorns beneath. It was the face of fear, but not for himself, fear for her. Aodhgall MacCraith, Lord of Rùm, the warrior feared by clans and strangers alike, trembled like a child. And that could mean only one thing. He loved her. A fleeting wave of tenderness warmed her inside, like a flame lit in the night. If she died there, at least she would know she hadn't been indifferent to him. But she didn't want to die. Not yet. Not like this. She wanted to speak to him. To tell him she was sorry, that she had been wrong, that her flight was not disdain but fear. Fear of getting lost in love, like her mother. But Aodhgall didn't need to hear it to know. In that look was forgiveness, desperation, and surrender. Aodhgall took a step toward Terbert, his hand already on his sword's hilt. Dòrnait tensed, sensing the explosion to come. But he held back. He spoke. Argued. Though she couldn't hear the words, their stances, gestures, and glances said it all. Terbert smiled, arrogant, like a child who has set in motion a cruel play. Then a name exploded like a broken bell. Bastard! Aodhgall shouted, his voice rolling along the coast like thunder. Dòrnait felt a pang of fear. She saw him rush at Terbert, and only Torcall MacCuinn's hand stopped his sword from finding flesh. Torcall, loyal as the ancient heroes of bardic tales, intervened with the honor and righteous fury of a brother. "Get my sister off that cursed rock," Torcall demanded, his voice rough as stone. "Stay out of this, MacCuinn," Terbert replied venomously. "She's my sister too." That too sank like lead into the air. A mockery. A claim of blood unearned. Dòrnait didn't hear Torcall's answer, but her expression showed the insult to his lineage had been too much. Then Terbert pronounced his sentence. "Dòrnait will come out unharmed," he said theatrically, "if Rùm surrenders." The injustice, so absurd, made even the stones seem to groan. It was a trade fit for Cain, not brothers. But Aodhgall did not protest. His voice was calm, too calm. "What do you want?" "Your surrender. You for her." Aodhgall lowered his gaze, as if calculating life and death. A battle would be uncertain. He might reach Dòrnait before she drowned, or maybe not. Terbert knew it. And Aodhgall too. When he spoke again, Dòrnait knew without words. He was accepting. She shouted before she realized it. No. The wind carried her voice away, but Aodhgall's expression changed. He looked at her and she shook her head, her eyes pleading, desperate. A wave then struck her, almost throwing her into the sea, but she held on with nails and shoes, digging her feet into the crack like roots in the rock. Hold on a little longer. Aodhgall shouted, with a voice not human but sacred, as if conjuring the ancient gods to keep her on this earth a little more. She saw him disarm. Drop the dagger. Loosen the sword strap. Every gesture was a surrender, a farewell, a sacrifice. And suddenly, she understood everything. He was going to sacrifice himself for her. A MacCraith for a Cambrach. Just like in the curse. That a MacCraith would give his life for a Cambrach in an act of love. Tuathla Cambrach's words echoed in her mind like an ancient chant. She herself, descendant of the woman who had been both victim and witch, now stood on the edge of repeating history. She couldn't allow it. Not this time. Not if the love was true. The decision rose within her like a cry. She knew then what she had to do. She had lived a slave to her fears, to the past, to a shadow that was not hers. But love required courage. And she was strong. Aodhgall had told her so. No, she shouted again, her voice clear as a church bell. Everyone turned to her. Dòrnait took a deep breath. The water was ice, the sea a beast. But her eyes shone with a light that was not of this world. And without thinking twice, she threw herself into the sea. The water wrapped around her like a shroud. Everything was darkness and cold. But this time Dòrnait was not a girl drowning in her fears. This time she was a woman fighting for love. Aodhgall dove headfirst into the waves. The sea breeze carried a salty, ancient scent, as if it bore the voices of creatures that had inhabited these waters before men. Under Scotland's overcast sky, night fell with the solemn weight of a celestial shroud. The stars had not yet dared to appear, and twilight stained the blackened walls of Cradmer Castle with ash-grey hues, standing like a silhouette cut against the horizon. The castle's centuries-old stones, worn by time and storms, seemed to exhale a living story dense with secrets and broken oaths. Aodhgall climbed with Dòrnait in his arms along the cobbled path leading from the shore into the castle. Each step was a heartbeat, a scream held tight in his chest. She still trembled, her lips blue and her body barely covered by the tartan Furchar had thrown over her. But she was alive. And he had no intention of letting go. "Is she awake?" asked one of the maids, running to open the doors to the great hall. "Enough," Aodhgall replied without even looking at her. His eyes were fixed on Dòrnait, as if fearing that if he looked away, the sea might take her away once more. Inside the castle was warm, with torches flickering against the stone walls and the scent of burning dry heather in the hearths. Shadows danced like ancient druids between the columns, and a sacred echo seemed to hang in the air, as if saints and spirits whispered to each other. When they reached the corridor of the east wing, Furchar stepped out to meet him, stopping him once again. "You can't stay with her tonight, Rùm," he said firmly, though concern still clouded his gaze. "She needs rest, not more fire." Aodhgall stood still. What burned in his chest was not lust. It was something else, older and fiercer. Love, yes, but also the fear of having lost her, the rage of knowing she had almost slipped through his fingers like seawater. And the weight of the curse, always there, creeping through the corners of his soul. "I won't stay," he finally murmured, "but I won't let her go until she's warm and safe." Furchar nodded and opened the door to a nearby chamber, more modest than the clan chief's but sheltered, with a lit fireplace and steaming jugs of hot water in a copper basin. Aodhgall carefully laid Dòrnait on the bed, tucked her in with thick woolen blankets, and with trembling hands brushed his fingers across her forehead. She opened her eyes. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice rough. "Your face." She gave a weak smile. "And thank God, it's not an angel's." He let out a brief laugh, barely a broken sigh. I thought I'd never see you again. Dòrnait, you. Shush. Don't say anything now, she whispered, her fingers searching for his. I'm fine. I'm with you. A faint tapping at the window made them both turn. Night had settled firmly over the cliffs, and a flock of crows rose from the beach, as if carrying the echoes of a battle still burning in the other world. In Celtic tradition, crows were messengers of the goddess Morrigan, symbol of war and death, but also of renewal. Aodhgall looked away and stood up. You have to rest, he said, more to himself than to her. And I have to decide what to do with the brother who almost killed you. Dòrnait, half asleep, murmured. Don't kill him. Not yet. For you? He asked. For me, she nodded weakly. And because this isn't over yet. That a MacCraith would give his life for a Cambrach in an act of love. He remained silent for a moment, while Sorsa entered with herbs and broth. The fireplace crackled softly, casting warm shadows over his hardened face. The sea kept roaring in the distance, like an angry old man who could not rest. Somewhere beyond time, ancient prophecies woven by seer nuns and wandering druids continued whispering their verses. The door closed with a barely audible whisper, as Sorsa left the room, leaving behind a breeze heavy with peat salt and dying embers. Though the old woman had assured him that Dòrnait was well, Aodhgall couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine like black ivy. He walked silently through the warm chamber, where the crackling fire was the only sound breaking the thick silence of the stone. He knelt to stoke the embers with an iron rod, then clumsily arranged the tartan over Dòrnait's still fragile body. She stifled a giggle, mischievous and sweet like an out-of-season lark's song. With that expression, you look more like a grumpy nursemaid than a warrior. Stop worrying so much. Sorsa already said, I'm fine. Once free of the soaked shirt, the cold quickly fled, like an evil spirit before the cross. Aodhgall raised his eyes and surveyed her. The fire flickered in his pupils, and a primal desire stirred within him like a lunar tide. Dòrnait knew it. That creature, part witch and part saint, part Celtic maiden and part Christian lady, knew the power she held over him. Slowly she lowered the blanket, revealing the pale curve of an ivory breast, soft and round like a heron's egg. Are you sure it won't work? She whispered, brows raised and lips parted. Aodhgall sat beside her, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and tenderly stroked her face. His hands, hardened by steel and storms, trembled as they brushed her skin. My God, Dòrnait, when I saw you leap from the rocks. His voice cracked like a branch under the weight of snow. He looked away for a moment, unable to hold her gaze. I thought I'd lost you. I was going to kill you, she whispered. And I wouldn't have cared. I would, Dòrnait said, her voice trembling. I wouldn't have borne it. He closed his eyes, still hearing the sea's roar in his ears and feeling the sharp cold of the waters when he saw her disappear. Terbert is alive. Prisoner. Aodhgall guards him until the king decides his fate. Dòrnait sighed, relieved. The firelight danced in her eyes, like candles lit on Samhain's Eve when souls cross between worlds. He doesn't deserve my pity, but prison is a punishment more lasting than death. Let him drag his defeat like a yoke. If I'd been a minute later, I would have killed him. I had to reach you. If you do something like that again, Dòrnait, I'll lock you in the highest tower. I felt my heart stop. Dòrnait took his hands in hers. They were strong, rough, but warm. Then now you understand what I felt. I couldn't just watch you sacrifice yourself. You gave me courage. I just needed to remember what you taught me, how to breathe underwater like the maidens of the enchanted loch. He smiled, both sad and proud. I'm so proud of you, girl. But next time jump into the lake, not the raging sea. Suddenly, the humor vanished from Dòrnait's face, as if a shadow had passed over her soul. I can't believe what my brother did. Terbert was poisoned by hatred. I should have told you, but I thought you wouldn't believe me. I never imagined he'd try to hurt you. I fell into his trap. I let myself be dragged down by pain like banshees by their wails. I shouldn't have left. No. You can't run every time fear bites you. I know, she murmured. You said I didn't understand the weight of duty. You were right. For me, duty was always a synonym for loss. I never understood that love is also a kind of responsibility. Aodhgall gently lifted her face. I only need one promise. That you won't leave. Even if we argue, even if you hate me for a moment, stay. She nodded, with a trembling smile. I won't board the first ship leaving for the Hebrides, I swear. I made mistakes too, he said. I forced you. Didn't give you time. You had every right to call me barbaric. You weren't. I wanted to hurt you, but I knew you'd never hurt me. Aodhgall lowered his gaze. Not because of that kiss, no. But because of his deal with Aodhgall, using her like a lamb in a wolf's game. I felt like just another piece on a warboard, Dòrnait whispered. Like my mother, manipulated and forgotten. I couldn't accept that you loved me and hid something like that. But now I understand your silence. From the moment I met you, I knew you'd be my ruin or my salvation. I wanted to protect you. And also keep you. I won't thank Aodhgall for anything, but I'm glad fate brought us together. Aodhgall laughed, tired, surrendered to that stubbornness he loved so much. I married out of duty, yes, but very soon I did it for you. And I love you, Dòrnait said, her eyes shining. I can't demand everything, I know. You're a chief, a man of war. But if you have to belong to the clan, at least your heart, your soul must be mine. They already are. They always have been. She leaned forward and took a delicate silver necklace hanging from the back of the chair. She slipped it over his head and placed it around Aodhgall's neck. It was her mother's amulet, a Celtic cross with intertwined knots and a stone blue as the sea before a storm. Now it belongs to you. He swallowed. Are you sure, girl? Dòrnait nodded. You saved me. Now I choose you. Not as a prisoner, but as a wife. He said nothing. He leaned in and kissed her, first with the reverence of a man before a sacred relic, then with the eagerness of a mortal on the edge of perdition. His lips tasted of salt honey and ancient promises. When they parted, she touched his wet chest with her fingers, searching for him. I'm freezing, she murmured with a smile. Don't you have any way to warm me up? Don't tempt me, woman, he growled, gripping her wrist. There's no turning back after this. Our marriage isn't registered yet. If you change your mind. I don't want to look back anymore, Aodhgall. Only forward. With you. Then he let her go, and she took him gently. The rest was silence, ragged breaths, bodies entwined beneath the clan firs, while outside the north wind struck the castle battlements as if to bless the union with the ancient language of the Druids. Love at last found its form amid the mist, duty and blood. Chapter 42. Dunbray Castle, coast of Aodhgall. Dark night. The sea, a dark beast breathing slowly. The battlements of Dunbray Castle stood sharply against a sky heavy with low clouds, thick like unspoken omens. The wind, soaked with the salt of the northern sea, slipped through ancient walls and whispered of pagan times when Celtic gods rode through the mist. Inside, far from the howl of the wind and the guards' footsteps, Dòrnait and Aodhgall were alone. An oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, as if the old spirits of the place silently attended a sacred rite. The bed, covered with deer skins and rough wool blankets, creaked with every movement, but all they heard was the shared beat of their hearts. Dòrnait was the first to touch him. Her hands trembled with desire and resolve. To her his body was a map, drawn by God and the steel of battlefields. Under her fingers, the muscles of a man who had seen death tightened and now claimed life. He was not just a warrior, he was human, whole, vulnerable, alive. But there was no rush. Not yet. When Aodhgall shed his clothes, it was as if a wolf shed its skin, solemn, almost ceremonial. Dòrnait welcomed him not with submission, but with that wild openness known only to those who have loved beyond fear. Their bodies met, rough scars against soft skin, like two elements that had sought each other for centuries. When he kissed her with lips of stone and fire, she knew there was no turning back. "Don't hold back," she whispered. "Show me everything. Your storm too." Aodhgall looked at her. In his eyes the sea. In his eyes the battle. In his eyes her. Then he wrapped her like a wave breaking every dam. Without restraint but with depth. He touched her with devotion, savored her like a pilgrim entering a goddess's temple. Their souls met in a space beyond time, ancient as the earth, new as the first morning. When they joined, it was like a sword returning to its sheath, complete, precise. Her body welcomed him, her spirit opened. For a moment the world held its breath. Only they remained. Only this now. The movement grew stronger, more urgent. Every breath, a promise. Every glance, a vow. They clung to each other, as if letting go meant being lost forever. The storm outside found its echo in what happened between them, Beltane in their blood, Samhain in their breath. Dòrnait clung to him, with hands, legs, everything she was. She wanted this moment to last forever. That nothing remained but the two of them, fused in the fire of the night. Aodhgall led her deeper, farther, until their voices shook the stone. And when he gave himself to her, it was like a river sweeping everything in its path. She answered with a force that could split sky and earth. But he did not stop. He moved within her slowly, like a prayer written in flesh. Every breath, an offering. Every glance, a new promise. At the end, they lay still. Sweaty. United. Wordless. But knowing. What they had shared was more than desire. It was a sacrament. The fusion of two souls marked by blood, loss, and the ancient breath of a land still alive beneath them. He held her like something sacred. She closed her eyes. And somewhere deep within the ancient castle a Celtic god, perhaps Lu, perhaps Dagda, listened in silent acceptance. And who knows? Perhaps in a hidden chapel a small candle was lit, a sign that even in darkness love remains sacred. Epilogue. September 1611, Cradmer, coast of Rùm. Shall I compare you to a summer's day? You are more lovely, and more temperate. Rough winds shake the buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. But your eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of the grace you own. William Shakespeare, Sonnet 18. At the margins of land and sea, where the mist still whispered ancient names and the ravens traced black circles in the sky, Dòrnait walked with a serene step across the moors stretching beyond the Cradmer castle. The western wind, tempered by the last breath of summer, caressed the tall grasses and swayed the wildflowers, bluebells, purple thistles, and blooming heather. Everything vibrated with a strange stillness, as if the world held its breath before speaking. By her side, Aodhgall walked with the quiet strength of one who had known battle and survived love. His gaze was set on the horizon, where the sea broke into silver against the cliffs. In his arms he cradled one of his children with firmness and tenderness. The other slept wrapped in Dorna's tartan, pressed to his chest like a second heart. "It's as if the land itself has blessed us," she murmured, her voice filled with awe. It had been barely 12 moons since their return to Cradmer, but everything before seemed like another life. The struggles, the broken oaths, the blood spilled on stone, it all belonged to the past. Since the Cambrach clan had retreated, thanks in part to the discreet maneuvers of her cousin and the timely intervention of the Privy Council, peace had taken root in that ancient soil. The reconstruction of the castle had been slow, as if each stone remembered its place and waited to be touched by the hands of its people. The battlements now rose with dignity. The towers, blackened by years of neglect, had been restored. The chapel where they prayed to St. Columba and lit candles for Brigid now smelled of wax and incense again. The lands were abundant, the cattle grazed fat and content, and the children played once more without fear of enemy riders. And yet, there was something more. something invisible, like the silver thread that, according to Celtic legends, binds true lovers across time and death. "Do you think she's happy for us?" Dòrnait asked, her eyes following the dance of a white butterfly. "Who?" Aodhgall said, raising an eyebrow. "Tuathla Cambrach," she replied, her voice soft but clear. He smiled. His face, once marked by fury and pain, had softened with days of peace and the closeness of his family. Though he remained a warrior, the scars still there beneath his skin, and in his gaze, there was now a new light in him. As if love had disarmed him and rebuilt him from within. "I thought you weren't superstitious." "I'm not. But look for yourself, the brooch that once brought ruin now shines like a star. The sea has forgiven us its storms, the trees bear fruit as if it were the days of Lunasa. And then there are them," she said, lowering her gaze to the twins. The boy Fionn slept in his father's arms with a faint frown, as if already dreaming of battles. He had his father's eyes, and his uncle Fionn's chin, the one who had united them unknowingly. The girl, Ailey, had her mother's quiet sweetness and a small pale spot on her forehead, like a trace of the moon. Aodhgall bent down. He kissed Dòrnait's lips with reverence, then the warm forehead of the girl. "Yes, my girl. I believe Tuathla has found peace," he said, and in that moment the sun broke through the clouds, and the silver brooch on his tartan flashed as if an angel had passed, brushing the earth. Dòrnait's eyes watered, but not out of sadness. That moment contained everything she had ever longed for: love, home, family, and a land that belonged to them by right and by blood. That castle with its ancient stones, its echoes of prayers and war songs, was alive once more. "Tuathla has found peace," she thought. "And so have I." In the distance, atop the hill where the ancient druids once made their offerings, a solitary stag watched them, still as if it were a messenger from Cernunnos, the horned god of the forests. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. The chapel bells began to ring, announcing the arrival of the first guests for Roisel's wedding. The sound spread like a blessing, uniting the sea, the sky, the stone, and the blood. Aodhgall took Dòrnait's hand, and together with their children they returned to the castle. The gates of Cradmer opened to welcome them. And in its walls, among the worn runes and Christian crosses, the ancient and new gods seemed to smile. The fire of sacred balance. There was a time when man lit the fire and offered it to the woman. It was not a gesture of power, but of trust. For she, guardian of the womb of creation, would know how to hold it without being consumed. That balance, between the firmness of doing and the tenderness of being, between direction and containment, is the forgotten alchemy of ancient times. Today, the world is waking from a long night of imbalance. The wars of the ego have drowned the voice of the soul. But not all is lost. There are men who bow their heads once more with humility, and women who remember not from the wound, but from the wisdom of lineage. In that sacred space where the masculine protects without dominating, and the feminine leads without subjugating, the true gateway to conscious creation opens. It is there that not only children are born, but new ways of living. To love is the oldest right. And only when the heart of man and the vision of woman embrace without fear does the earth sing again. The end.